This is Katrin with Disability Rights New York. Welcome to our podcast, Empire State of Rights, where we bring you information on the most relevant topics regarding disability rights and advocacy. Today, we welcome DRNY PAIMI and PATBI Program Director, Marc Fliedner, and PAD Staff Attorney, Alyssa Galea. They are here to discuss advocacy strategies to ensure the inclusion of people with disabilities in emergency preparedness and response. Marc, Alyssa, thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, great to be here.
So before we start, I just want to give my self-description. My name is Katrin Haldeman. I'm a woman in my late 40s. I have brown wavy hair and light-colored eyes. I'm wearing a white shirt today. I have a blue stone on a necklace, if you can see it, and I have some wood flowered earrings in today. And Marc and Alyssa, if you could please tell us a little bit about yourself, give a self-description for our audience.
I'm Marc Fliedner. As Katrin indicated, I'm the director of two programs here at Disability Rights New York right now. One is for folks with traumatic brain injury, which is one of those misunderstood and not well enough talked about disabilities. And then the PAMI program, which is protection and advocacy for individuals with mental illness. And we provide advocacy for all folks with significant mental illness and all children and youth who have significant emotional disturbance. And we love talking about this topic, Alyssa and I. I'm currently sitting and doing so in my office at our Brooklyn offices. I'm sitting wearing a summery shirt. It's like orange and beige. I got glasses on. I'm a white male. I've got a sort of a modern picture of a bridge behind me on a kind of a bright blue wall. Thank you.
And my name is Alyssa Galea. I'm a staff attorney in the PAD program here at DRNY, and that's protection and advocacy for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I am a white woman in my early 30s with glasses and long brown hair. I'm wearing a blue shirt with white polka dots, and I have the blurred Zoom filter background on today.
Thank you both so much. So we're talking about a big topic today. We're talking about emergency preparedness and how people who have disabilities are impacted by whether or not a city or a community is prepared. And so as we start this conversation, let's talk a little bit about some of the nuances of the language, right? So for those who may not know, the difference between emergency preparedness versus emergency response, let's talk a little bit about that and some examples of it.
We wanted to start that off by providing the working definition of emergency that we've been using in having these conversations. So that includes weather emergencies with an acknowledgement of the current and escalating climate change impacts, public health emergencies, as well as man-made emergencies, including construction emergencies and acts of mass violence. So with that said, when we're talking about emergencies, we often hear emergency preparedness and response kind of lumped together in the same sentence. But we really want to try and separate those along a timeline of sorts. So emergency preparedness would be the first step, which would be more proactive planning and policies before an emergency actually occurs. And then response would come later on in the timeline after the emergency as sort of the reactive, how do you provide assistance and solve the problems that the emergency itself has created. So one example would be something like, talking about a weather emergency. An emergency response, the weather emergency has come through and people need emergency shelters and opening up locations for people who had to leave their homes. But when we're talking about emergency preparedness, that could be the plans that occurred before that weather emergency to make sure as many people had what they needed so that they wouldn't have to leave their homes in the first place.
And so when we talk about any emergency, as you said, whether it is weather related or possibly an accident of some kind, we are looking at a lot of the ones in the recent past, right? So we have the COVID-19 pandemic that is still here. However, we had a shutdown that was involved in this. We have the Canadian wildfires with the air quality in especially New York State right now, flash floods in the Hudson Valley. Let's talk about some areas that could be improved in New York State current emergency response planning. What are the systemic failures that we're seeing right now where, some of these things, I think there could be planning for many different scenarios, and somehow we're still going to lose some of the areas that we need to address. However, systemically, I think we're seeing some failures as well. Marc, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is what drove us, and you and I, Katrin, have been talking about this for many years, right? Since we both started working at Disability Rights New York, is the fact that every time an emergency happens, our inclination as humans is to move on. It's not to take the time to do what I always refer to as a post-mortem. Okay, let's stop and breathe and look at data and make sure that the data is being created and maintained properly. And then say, what worked, good for us, how can we build on that? What didn't work, how do we solve that problem? And of course, what was a major thesis of a conference that Alyssa and I and some other members of a really dynamic team put together was the fact that, well, if we're having this postmortem or any planning conversations, and people with disabilities are not only at the table, as we say, but playing a leadership role, then all planning for the future is going to be devoid of the critical information that they need to provide about how these emergencies impact them personally and other members of the disability community. People with disabilities are the folks that are most harmed and most quickly harmed. And we don't really talk about how we are going to make, Alyssa made a reference to the, where somebody is evacuated to, shelter systems that people are evacuated to. Data from some organizations that we've come to work with, intervention strategies, came back saying that I went to a shelter and nobody had a way to communicate with me because there was no ASL interpreter or access to card services or anything. And nobody had a way to communicate with me as a person with a significant mental illness, let's say, because they weren't talking to me from a trauma-informed place, because folks with disabilities tend to come from a trauma-informed background, and then they're in the middle of what is certainly going to be one of the most traumatic events of their life. So it's really us rethinking the way that all of this planning takes place and putting the right elements in place before we move on to the next emergency.
And Marc, I want to just make a little finer point on some of the things that you just talked about, right? So I really appreciate you saying in the beginning, when we have an emergency like the shutdown through the pandemic, the idea of moving on seems to be something that's widespread, right? Because there is so much trauma that happens on a large level for us with the shutdown was globally, right? So there's the idea that if we can just get to what people were saying, the new normal, and being able to move on, we're missing so much. And in that, I think of the mental health impact of, first of all, the incident, second of all, moving on without having any real postmortem, as you say, on not just an incident, but on a community, and how all of the things that have impacted a community in an emergency situation, how those things are really going to snowball and have a bigger effect when these conversations aren't being had. Alyssa, Marc, if you could just talk a little bit about that part of it, because I think that's such an important part of the planning aspect of it, as well as the response.
So I think one of the interesting problems with the idea of moving on so quickly is it minimizes, right, for everyone, the idea of those traumas and the idea of, that one person's normal and another person's normal, those weren't the same to start with. So assuming that they're going to be impacted similarly is just completely unrealistic. And I think, when we expect everyone to go back to whatever their normal was and ignore, you're stratifying out kind of the people who were most impacted by this. And, if you take it at kind of the baseline of the median of the population, you're going to be ignoring a lot of the people who were impacted more significantly for whatever reason, and their needs are going to continue to be met. So continue to be unmet rather. So we're really just perpetuating some of the inequities by failing to stop, when conversely, right, we could take that opportunity to go back and reflect on, how do we make a more equitable and balanced system with the lessons we learned coming out of this. It's really a missed opportunity when we fail to have those conversations.
I couldn't agree more. First of all, points for using the term stratifying out, because I would never have come up with it, but it's a beautiful one. We have this, it's just this human instinct to want to move on. But the thing that we learned when we were reaching out to all of these national level folks that have been looking at this work is, first of all, that the majority of them who were looking at the impact on people with disabilities were, not surprisingly and wonderfully, people with disabilities, if not, sometimes multiple disabilities, right? And we were taking time to find out that we don't move on in any quick way. I mean, there's this extraordinary woman who runs a law firm, basically out of Puerto Rico, was explaining to us that they've gotten slammed with so many things, right? One after another. But a lot of the work that she does and that her law firm does is trying to get people what they need to get back into their home. And that can take months, years, even longer. And, the interesting thing is, when we look again at the limited data that there is, people with disabilities found in much more, larger numbers than other folks, that they never got back into their homes. So these are the kinds of examples of how disproportionately the impact is.
I think you both made really great points. Alyssa, I love how you said someone's normal or typical is going to be very different from someone else's when we're looking at moving beyond and whether it's in a good and healthy way or not. And of course, I keep coming back to the shutdown because it was global, and we learned so many lessons from that as a global community. But you're both really getting to the next part of our conversation, which is intersectionality, right? So there's the thing that I think we say here at DRNY a lot: if you've met one person with a disability, you've met one person with a disability, right? There isn't this broad stroke that we can brush an entire community with. And not only that, but we're still failing to see other aspects of not just a person, but it's also in terms of economics and in race and color and how people identify. And so all of the other parts of a person and parts of a community, when we're talking about intersectionality, we're talking about how all of these communities are in fact disproportionately affected by emergencies, and in several ways. So let's talk a little bit about that and how the sheer number, percentage of people in the population globally, as well as within our own communities. This is something that has to be looked at when we talk about data. Marc, you're bringing up data, and that it's so important that we look at these numbers. Let's start talking a little bit about that.
Well, go ahead, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that's exactly, one of the main points that came across from a lot of the speakers that we had at the conference that Marc mentioned earlier. And I just wrote down, a segment of one of them. We had a speaker by the name of Coco DeMont Thomas, and he talked about emergency preparedness from perspective of the deafblind community, and just emphasizing how much people can forget that it's one disability identity, but it's such a diverse community. And he pointed out that things like a person's linguistic and their cultural background can impact the very way that you communicate with someone to figure out what they need or how to help them. So if we're not talking about every person with a disability and then every part of each person with a disability, we're losing out on a lot of the important nuance of how to best support them in these kind of disasters.
Yeah, we were happy to have Coco because he was communicating with the audience and us by, using two interpreters because he is deaf and blind, a gentleman who sat beside him and was using Braille in his hand to interpret, and with information coming in from another interpreter externally. And look, in order to get this right, we need to be constantly educating ourselves. And that means that policymakers and community leaders need to be constantly educating themselves about disability. Within the last year, we had a comprehensive internal training about neurodivergence and neurodivergent, disabilities and how they impact on people's processing of information and communication overall. As I indicated, I run a traumatic brain injury program, and that is so unclear to certain people and so often sort of misdiagnosed to be other things. So there's a responsibility, and this is to meet with the tenets of the Americans with Disabilities Act. There's a responsibility for community leaders at the federal, state, and local level to be constantly educating themselves. And of course, the best way to do that is bring folks from each of these facets of the disability community into the discussions.
I think language is something we saw that really was highlighted through the shutdown. And of course, I will, toot our own horn here in the ASL case that really informed a lot of what happened across the nation, ensuring that we had in-camera ASL for updates from our leaders. And this is something that highlighted sign language for many people who didn't necessarily know that sign language and closed captioning were two different languages, or that there were more than one sign language, right? So when we talk about preparing at the very minimum, the very base level of being prepared for a community is language and language access. And to your point, Alyssa, if you cannot communicate with someone, if you cannot have someone comprehend the information that you are giving to them, we're failing at a very basic level, because then we're not having any information transferring from one group to another. And I want to talk a little bit about technology in that, right? We have seen technology has changed the way we've done a lot of things, even to how we're recording this podcast right now. Virtual platforms became the new norm, and really seeing how different types of accessibility were available to our communities changed the way that really a lot of people did business. If we can just talk a little bit about how technology plays such an important role when it comes to emergency planning as well as emergency response, because I think here's an area where these are two things that will come together when we're talking about technology and how people can communicate with each other.
I guess I want to start just with, a brief reminder of the opposite too, is that I think in today's day and age, with all of the tools that we have at our disposal, we forget sometimes that even things such as broadband internet access are not available even in, some of the portions of New York State. So I think it's important that any emergency planning or response program keep in mind, that people aren't necessarily going to have access to technology, electricity, internet, and coming up with a plan to make sure that those folks aren't left behind. But in cases where the technology is available, I completely agree that there are just so many different options available now. Look at how medical care and other services are provided. Just a couple years ago, the idea of sitting down for like a FaceTime call with your doctor would have just seemed completely unrealistic, something out of the movies for most people. But now it's readily available to a lot of people who do have that type of access. And so, some of the issues with transportation, with communication. We can take advantage of the video, the electronic, means that we have to connect people who aren't necessarily in the same space. And I mean, to your point about the podcast, right? Like, we're in, I believe, 3 different cities right now, sitting down and having a conversation. And it's a cool benefit for us. It can be really a lifeline for a lot of people, especially in, we know, a lot of areas, transportation access, particularly for people with physical disabilities, is not great, if it even exists. And so thinking about how we can utilize those sort of technologies to make sure that people have more equitable access and connections to one another.
I have some things that came to mind explicitly from Alyssa's words. First of all, picking up right where you left off, in terms of intersectionality, one thing we haven't talked straight out about in this conversation is economic justice. You referenced it, by those who don't have, a laptop or a cell phone or whatever, and needed to know what was going on day to day with the pandemic. And there are certain communities that are more, are less prepared than others. And what was interesting was Buffalo, where we had a very significant blizzard fairly recently, unprecedented, right? They, in doing a postmortem, and they get major credit for that, one of the largest problems that they had was that the emergency services vehicles, there wasn't a plan for how to get the emergency services vehicles from one place to another, because the blizzard was so bad that the roads were absolutely unmanageable. So these are the things that they're taking a moment to look at now and try and change. And another thing that you reminded me of is that it's great that we can use the technology, but also built into planning has to be, what if, because of the nature of the weather emergency, all of the technology goes away? Right. So there have to be some fundamentals built in, like the things we talk about with folks having their emergency kit, all, and very specific things that they need to be able to be comfortable for a period of, a couple of weeks or something before they evacuate. So the fundamentals are important too. And we keep learning that over and over again.
I couldn't agree more. I think of any of us who work closely with our cell phones for work. If we get into an area where we don't have service, it feels like we no longer can be in touch with anyone. And that is a big source of, I think, concern for most people. What if we do lose, whether it's power or Wi-Fi for a certain amount of time? And again, the economic part of it is so critical for us to think about. Even if we look at New York State as a microcosm, we have very rural areas in New York State. Then we have the metropolitan area, which is packed with people, and they will have an experience that will be very different, vastly different. However, if one of the issues is power, which would include Wi-Fi, were to go out for a very long time, we would all be impacted in similar ways. And before I forget, I keep wanting to plug the workshops that you did, the team with DRNY. It was a week long. We have these videos that are up on our YouTube channel, and we will put the links to those in the notes of the podcast. And it was exceptional. So there were people that had lived experience, which I think we talk about all the time as being some of the most valuable, if not the most valuable information that we can get. Because if we're not listening to the people who are impacted the most, then our information and our planning is going to be flawed. And so I wanted to let the audience know about those links that will be in the notes of the podcast. But let's also talk about, what did we learn from not just that workshop itself, but in all that we've been doing. And I really think since probably the shutdown, I feel like we as an organization really started to look at things in a very different way. But what we've learned, what else and what other actions are really needed to improve the federal, state, and local emergency response planning? We've heard a lot of information, and what are the takeaways that you are both hearing?
Well, Alyssa and I were talking about this yesterday, and the fundamental is that the federal, state, and local entities that you're referring to need to be in coordination with each other. And they all need to be up to speed with accessibility issues and all of these different things. So the key is actually the coordination. And that's one thing we learned. I also, if you'll let me go there, the most interesting thing that I learned by meeting with these experts that have been doing the work for a while and now are really energized because we seem to have to keep doing the work on an accelerated basis, is the ethical implications of how all folks are handled, how their lives are handled during an emergency. You know, everybody's playing triage, but triage tends to, from an ethical perspective, value the lives of people who are people without disabilities more than the lives of people with disabilities, and certainly more than those folks view themselves. And so there's this fundamental discrimination that can be built in. And as lawyers, I think we have to be really vigilant about making sure that anything that falls into the triage mode or anything planning that it's like, what can we do to save the most people, does not fall into that, what I think is a really unethical place. And some of the most extraordinary people we met, right, Alyssa, were these young people with disabilities who are committed to bioethics and spreading the word about bioethics and how it has to be built into everything that we do in our lives, and probably nothing more importantly than emergency preparedness in that.
I definitely agree. I think, from a personal perspective, one of my points of ignorance, it was definitely highlighted when we were searching for speakers. Like, emergency preparedness and response is literally some people's careers. And I think that led to me, my biggest takeaway is if we're only talking about emergency and preparedness and response when there's a pandemic or a hurricane, we're doing it all wrong. This needs to be an ongoing and ever evolving conversation so that everyone in society is right up ahead of the next disaster in whatever form it takes, and knows, what we need to do to be prepared and how we're going to respond and how we're going to make sure that we do better the next time. It can't be a one shot, piecemeal conversation. It has to be something that is on the forefront of our minds all the time.
I couldn't agree more, Alyssa. And one of the things you said, the ever evolving, right? So I don't want to say our disasters are ever evolving, but truly they are. There are things that we're experiencing in our lifetime where maybe our parents didn't necessarily experience, and they experienced things that we didn't experience. And so generationally, we're going to see an evolution of what we need to respond to. So for there to be some boilerplate response planning, that also seems like that would be woefully irresponsible for us as a global community to not look at how is the evolution of response. I mean, really, that is what we need to be looking at. And when we talked about coordination, I find that is one part of how all of these systems need to work. Then there's the education part, right? And so what I found very interesting in rewatching some of the videos from the workshop is that there are things that the general audience, general population just does not know. They don't think about it. And it's not because they don't want to, it's because there has been no experience that they have had personally that has led them to interact with the information. And to say that more simply, they don't necessarily know someone that has a disability or how a disaster is going to impact them. Talk a little bit about how that piece of it, where if we don't have coordination with different agencies that have the information, that have the education, as well as people with lived experience, how is it that the general population can get more informed and think about these things on a regular basis?
Well, this is where the technology comes in great, because we found our speakers, sort of like the new old-fashioned way, which is we started with Google and we wanted to find everybody who'd done this work. So there is so much information that is available for those who have the internet access, and for those who don't, maybe think about finding a library that does provide it to you, or some other opportunity. But it's out there. There are great papers being written. There are great conversations happening, like the ones that people can expose them to here. We're going to turn the elements of that conversation into a report with certain recommendations for all policymakers at the federal, state, and local level to follow based on what these experts told us. And the exciting thing about that is that two things about how can we learn. The more you dig into it, I assure you, anybody that's listening, the more energized you're going to get about it and want to know more. Alyssa and I came to this from a pretty basic fundamental standpoint, that we knew that people were disproportionately impacted, but we hadn't gone into the nuts and bolts. And then the group, we kept getting more and more energized, and we certainly don't want to stop. And I think that those that are interested are going to find themselves in the same position. And then, because of technology, once we learn the best ways to access it, these communications, these interactions take place, and one person's work builds on another. And it's actually been, for me, I won't speak for you, Alyssa, but it's been one of the most rewarding aspects of my disability rights career, is to have these new relationships, have these new conversations. And we're having this conversation. All of us, we're coming from Rochester, Albany, and New York City, and we're all suffering, as is the entire world, a heat wave, which represents the hottest recorded temperatures in our planet's history. So I think the climate change crisis that we have is one that absolutely demands us to be looking at this, because of all the different ways that it plays out, that being one particular example.
No, I agree completely. And I think, to some extent on a basic level, it all comes back down to visibility, right? And one of the big things we focus on in a lot of aspects at DRNY is community inclusion and integration. But, when people see people with disabilities as their family, friends, neighbors, and parts of their community, and not, some people who are separate in someplace else, you start thinking about, their needs and supports the same way. All of us need certain things and supports, when it comes to an emergency situation. The whole idea of community is none of us are able to do this on our own. But it just highlights to me the importance of, everyone recognizing that people with disabilities are part of the community, and their needs need to be taken into account just as everyone else's are.
And I would even say that as we talk about there is no definition of a person with a disability in terms of how you identify that person. I think that's one of the things that I would say technology for me has been the biggest way to really bring out the fact that there are people that have disabilities that you don't know just by looking at them. And that we've had this idea culturally, I think, for too long, that unless you see someone who is using some type of mobility device, then you don't necessarily know that there's a disability with that person. And the fact is that all of the people in your community need to have their needs met. And so it's not about identifying based on how someone looks, which of course that does apply to so many other areas as well. But it is very much to what you said, Alyssa. We are a community, and within each community, we have people that have very specific needs, and it's really time for us to start looking more closely at that. And so as we talked a little bit about some of the things that DRNY is doing to really ensure the inclusion of people with disabilities and accessibility around emergency preparedness and planning, are there any other things that you want to share with us that are doing outside of the report and our regular, I don't say our regular day-to-day work, but that is what we do every day. Talk to us a little bit about any other things that we're working on right now.
Well, this is a remarkable little anecdote that I have stemming from our conference that puts the global community in perspective. So I got an email shortly after the conference from students in South Korea who said, we are working on emergency preparedness strategies for people with disabilities, but we're sure that you all in New York State are way ahead of us on it. Sadly, that's not necessarily true. And what he said was, one of the things we're working on is, and again, talk about basics, a buddy system. And who among us doesn't want to help our neighbors? Particularly, if there's one thing that we're good at in this particular, nation, and I think people worldwide get good at under emergencies, is wanting to help the person next door who needs a hand. And it's this, he said, we want to talk to you about the use of a buddy system where if I'm a person without a disability and the person with the disability lives next door, what is my plan for what I'm going to do to take care of my needs as well as theirs? And it's actually not something that has been firmly implanted in any of our strategies here in New York State or in the US. So, but then I, am jazzed about that, the fact that we're going to be meeting with them when they come to New York in just a couple of weeks to exchange ideas. And then I go over to Brooklyn Borough Hall, which is over there. And because we're having a meeting about, it's for Disability Month, right? Kind of a kickoff. And I talked to one of the borough president's people about, like, what about this buddy system? I think we could do this in Brooklyn, and she said, yeah, there's a program that somebody had to track certain people with disabilities, and maybe it could be, modified to come up with the buddy piece of it. Like, this is what is not only exciting and very rewarding, but is going to keep us energized to keep the conversation going, is that it starts conversations that continue. A conversation that started in South Korea ends up on my desk because they saw the conference that we put on, and then I walk over to Borough Hall and start talking about it. So that's a beautiful thing.
That's really cool. That really is. And so, Alyssa, do you have anything to add to any of the other things that we're doing?
I don't think so of anything specific, only, to highlight what Marc said. We put this conference together and the idea that it wasn't going to be a one and done event, but we really are excited to take the relationships and the connections that we've made with both the speakers and the audience members, and hopefully, the report to generate some additional interest and connections there, and use that to continue collaboration so we can make sure that these conversations continue evolving. Yeah.
And so we hear a lot about the catchphrase, which is nothing about us without us. And we hear it a lot of the disability community, but we don't necessarily hear it outside of the community. But when we talk about having a seat at the table, right, there's planning that's happening on the local level all the way up, local, state, federal level, and ensuring that we have people with disabilities on these committees, in these groups, in these conversations. What are some things that we can do to ensure that this is happening? I mean, there are planning councils that are, grassroots and on the local level that definitely do a lot. And we need to have people who have lived experience at the highest level. What are some things that, whether it's someone at home who's listening to this podcast or is thinking about getting involved, what can they do? And what can we as a community do to make sure that these seats are being filled by people who can speak to what's actually needed?
I found that there are groups everywhere that are doing this work. And so, using simple terms like disaster strategies or, disaster coalition or anything like that, we'll find groups that you can become a part of. And, we're all busy. And if you only put your foot gently in and then kind of progress from there, that's a start. I actually, for example, now attend the monthly events that are put on by Zoom by one of our speakers, actually a moderator, June Kales, Alyssa, and she's a person with disabilities. And next month, the topic is how to make remote and what's the opposite of remote? Live sessions work well together, so that people with disabilities who can't make the live session are able to participate. So those are the things that are happening, and I think that as we continue to educate ourselves, that we find ways. And what I'm thinking is, while some of us on this call may identify as people with disabilities, I think it's getting allies to realize the value in what we're saying and how rewarding it would feel to be part of this movement. Because if the allies can nudge the policymakers, as well as the people with disabilities nudging the policymakers, then we get more, we get more traction.
I agree with that completely. I think one of the simplest and easiest things that people can do is just let other people know that you care. There are no shortage of groups for people with disabilities out there, for family members, for advocates, but tell your friends and family that this is an issue you care about. Tell the people who represent you and the people that you vote for that you care about this, and just make sure that the conversation keeps happening.
We've talked about this, we've talked around it a little bit today in our other question and answers, but we're looking at two different areas of advocacy, both systemic and individual, right? And for some of our audience, they may not know what the difference is or how we can look at the differences in these two areas of advocacy. Let's talk a little bit about it, because systemic is something that I feel like, we can really talk about in much broader terms, but when it comes to individual advocacy and emergency response, it is more nuanced. These are some of the things that we've been hitting on just in the last bit of the conversation, whether it's the buddy system or just talking about what our needs are. Let's talk about the differences in these two areas of advocacy, especially when when we're talking about emergency response.
Sure. So, I think that that's a really important question, because both systemic and individual advocacy are super important, and they can oftentimes have the same goals, but there are certain problems, certain policies. Marc doesn't love when I quote him, but he was a speaker at on one of the conference panels and talked about litigation experience that DRNY's had. And I believe you mentioned previously, Katrin, with like the sign language accessibility case during the early days of the pandemic. So there's things like that where it's a policy that impacts a broad group of people, but at the same time, there's individual people who have specific needs that they need met. And one of those examples, I think, was Marc mentioned, we had one of our conference speakers was an attorney from Puerto Rico. And she shared the work that they did in helping individual homeowners, claim disaster assistance after hurricane damage. And, one of the main problems, I think, with systemic advocacy sometimes is that it can get super complicated and it can take a lot of time. And sometimes it evolves to the point where you're talking about things in generalities, and we always try not to, but it can get easy sometimes for the individual people whose lives are being directly impacted to get a little lost in that theoretical conversation. And so when you're talking about individual advocacy, you might only be helping one person, but it could be completely changing the life of that one person. And to go back to the Puerto Rico example, that individual advocacy eventually evolved into, helping out so many individuals that it became a broader scale policy change. And it can certainly be more resource and time intensive. And, a lot of times it can be fewer people getting helped, but it makes a whole world of difference at the same time. And I pulled out actually a quote. So the attorney from Puerto Rico, her name is Ariadna Goudreau Aubert, and one of the things that she said was, quote, "I think the need for disaster legal aid or disaster legal work speaks a lot about how inaccessible this process is," end quote. And so I think that that's something also super important to keep in mind in this conversation too, is, you know, when people need to resort to the legal system, be it systemic or individual advocacy to get these problems fixed, that's going to shut out a lot of people for resource or other reasons. And we're never going to have, unfortunately, enough public service attorneys to help everyone who needs it. So as long as we're still operating into a system where we're having these inequitable policies and responses, and people are needing to get a lawyer to fix it, we're never going to be doing a good enough job.
And I'll just tag onto that by saying simultaneously, and it's easy to do, folks who have education on certain specific things, like what is in your emergency bag? People may think they're medicines. It's your medicines, and it's also prescriptions for the next set of medicines, and just things that you might not think of. So you've got a neighbor and you go over that with them, and you try and reach as many people as you can so that everybody is taking the degree of responsibility that they can for their plan. And that's good advocacy, that kind of education. And it's manageable to do, you know. We all got to get more adept at it.
That's a really powerful quote, Alyssa. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, because it really is such an indication of where we're at. If we need to get the legal system involved, and we're not prepared to deal with especially individual issues when it comes to emergency response. So I think we could probably talk about this topic for weeks, as you well know, because you did speak about it for a full week with so many different people. So let's talk a little bit about resources as we kind of wrap this up. What, for people who want to learn more about it, or who need to learn more about it and are thinking ahead and thinking, unfortunately, you know, there may be something else that's coming and they need to get prepared. Let's talk about resources that are available to both individuals as well as organizations if they need or want them.
Well, I mean, of course, we want to plug the conference recordings that, as Katrin mentioned, are available on the DRNY YouTube page. But the speakers, you know, were so generous with their knowledge and their resources as well, that we were able to develop a resource library to go along with that, with articles and videos, and I believe some good TED Talks that people can use to start with to educate themselves further as well.
And then again, start with basic Google terms, right? But like there's an organization called Partnership for Disaster Strategies, and you get all kinds of really, really interesting information, and then that leads you down other roads. Also, folks might want to check out their states, their or their local emergency management plan, and engage those who are, you know, responsible for implementation of those plans. You'll be interested to seeing what is in there, and you'll also be interested in seeing what's not in there. And unfortunately, that tends to be explicit references to how people with disabilities are going to be, you know, reached and afforded assistance under these circumstances.
That's really good advice, and I think you're probably right, Mark. We'll find out what is missing oftentimes when we go and especially look at our local level, and those are good things, right? I mean, I feel like crowdsourcing. We talk about crowdsourcing a lot for whether it's, you know, GoFundMe's or things like that, but crowdsourcing is wonderful to get information, especially in a after a disaster, to say what could we do better, what was missing, and when we start to talk to our local municipalities, I think we can find out, well, you know what, this is something that we could do a little bit better next time. So I suppose getting involved is really step one for me anyway, to know that I can go down and check in with my local municipality and see what needs to be done, or what can I do to help. And so before we sign off, is there anything else that we should talk about or that you want to share with our audience, especially during this heat wave?
I'm just going to say thank you for giving Alyssa and me the opportunity to address these issues, because we love talking about it and we think conversation breeds conversation.
I agree completely. Thank you so much.
Well, it is always a pleasure to speak with both of you, and I cannot wait to have you on again. And we will be talking again soon, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Empire State of Rights has been brought to you by Disability Rights New York, your source for disability rights and advocacy. If you enjoyed our program, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this post. The video for this episode is available on our YouTube channel with closed captioning and ASL interpretation. If there is a subject you would like us to discuss, please email podcast@drny.org or comment below. For more Empire State of Rights, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.